Hello, and welcome to the Climate Change Coalition of Door County's presentation with Bruce Nillis, The Urgent Need to Stop Burning Gas, Electrify Our Economy with Clean Power Now. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is our second presentation of our Wednesday speaker series for our season of action. The Climate Change Coalition of Door County is a nonprofit, volunteer-driven organization focused on educating the public of the science of climate change and hoping to inspire action to combat the climate crisis. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, climatechangedoorcounty.com. If you'd like to support our work, please visit our website and go to the Take Action page. You can also find a recording of this program or any of our other programs on our YouTube channel, Climate Change Coalition of Door County. This is a presentation of our Season of Action program. There are many events and hikes going on throughout the fall this year. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website and find our page, A Season of Action. And welcome Bruce Nillis. Bruce is the Executive Director of the Climate Imperative and Energy Innovation Project to cut carbon emissions at the speed and scale needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. He will discuss how we can and must move away from burning gas in our homes, businesses, and power plants. His talk will address the urgency of the climate threat we face. And thank you for joining us this evening, and welcome, Bruce.
Piece of my carbon footprint until 2 years ago were the 4 gas appliances in my home. My furnace, my water heater, my dryer, and my stove. I had no idea. As Roy said, I've been working on climate change and coal plant issues, and I had never realized that other than my flying, more emissions came out of my 4 gas appliances than out of anything else I did. And the only thing most people think about when they think about their appliances is their gas stove, and hence the provocative term or heading we used in this op-ed to help explain that gas in buildings is going to have to become like coal use in buildings, a relic of the past if we're going to meet our climate change goals. Let me run through a couple of slides to underscore this point. So globally, we're making progress on coal. And the new data as of 2019 shows that the biggest growth in emissions isn't anymore coming from coal, but from gas use. And this has 2 problems. One, it's obviously in and of itself a very large source of carbon emissions. And as the New York Times report, the fastest driver of emissions growth globally. But there's a second problem, one we didn't really understand 10 years ago, which is natural gas is primarily methane. About 85% of the gas that comes out of that powers our appliances is methane, which is a super pollutant. It is up to 80 to 100 times more potent for global warming purposes than carbon. We know it leaks. It leaks throughout the supply chain. So we've known for a while that it leaks at the drilling site. It also leaks at all the joints in our buildings, at the pipes under our streets, and even at the burner tip on our gas stoves. Not at levels where you typically smell it, but at levels where it contributes significantly to increasing the carbon, the climate impact associated with natural gas. So in the United States, let me ground you in sort of where we are. This is a slide showing the three fuels, coal, oil, and gas. The top is oil, and that's primarily used in transport. And emissions have been flat since 2007 and coming down slightly in 2020. As we start to get more efficient in our transport sector. You'll notice the blue line, the blue-green line, that's coal coming down nicely. Not quite on track with avoiding 1.5 degrees, but beginning to get there and should be done in the next 5-10 years. But look at what's growing, carbon emissions from gas. So where is all this gas being used? It's basically in 3 buckets. It's being used in our buildings, it's being used in our power plants, and it's being used in the industrial sector, and roughly in thirds. And so unlike coal and oil, which are very concentrated in one sector, tackling gas is going to require a comprehensive approach, including in buildings. This is just a slide nationally showing emissions by sector. I'm focused on the bottom right here, which is the fuels and buildings. As Roy said, it's not the biggest. It's about 10%. And that fuels in residential and commercial buildings on the right is broken down primarily from heat, particularly in colder climates like Wisconsin. About 20% is for water heating, and then about 13% for cooking and other things like dryers. And then the blue and red on the right-hand side is the split between residential and commercial, which are roughly 50-50. So addressing buildings, the 70 million buildings in the US that burn fossil fuels, is a big part of solving this puzzle. Wanted to break down buildings versus the power sector, just to give you a sense of the need for attention on buildings. So this is another way of looking at the data, comparing electricity emissions since 2007 to the building sector. All the attention we put onto the power sector, the electricity sector, to replace coal with clean electricity, as we're seeing in state after state, including Wisconsin, is driving emissions down. It's a good news piece of the story. There are other sectors where, despite things we have been doing, such as getting more efficient appliances, fluorescent lighting, LED lighting, into the marketplace, overall consumption has been flat. Overall emissions have been flat. And this, again, is the use of gas in buildings for those 4 primary appliances. So something needs to change, and that is about getting the use of fossil fuels out of the buildings and electrifying them with clean electricity. This is from the state of Wisconsin, where the emissions are. I just wanted to ground you in the bottom right-hand corner here, which is how are emissions doing in the state since 2005, which is the baseline that Joe Biden used nationally. So Joe Biden and the new administration committed the US to cut emissions by 50% over the next 9 years. How are we doing in Wisconsin? Well, as of 2017, we were down 8%. So the most recent data I've seen is very similar, maybe 10% since 2005. So we've cut emissions 10% in 15 years, 16 years. We now have another 9 years to get 40%. So the pace of decarbonization needs to pick up significantly. But I wanted to touch on a couple of other issues because there's good reasons to phase out the use of fossil fuels other than for carbon pollution. This is actually a study released today by at Harvard University, which was breaking down, as coal plants have been retiring, what are the major sources of air pollution that are left? And they made a remarkable finding that the burning of fossil fuels in buildings is now essentially causing the same level of health impacts as coal is. So you think about an individual home and the 4 gas appliances, not a ton of pollution, but the 70 million of them. And cumulatively, the burning of fossil fuels, according to this new study, has profound impacts in terms of 18,000 premature deaths and over $200 billion worth of health impacts that we're all paying through higher insurance premium and taxes. So it's a significant outdoor air pollution issue. But let me bring it back to the gas stove, as I started off with, because this is the one where I, after working on coal plants and air pollution, again, was sort of a really profound realization for me that the burning of fossil fuel is a bad idea. I've known that for a long time. Burning it indoors and thinking about all the other appliances that are required by law to be vented outdoors. So if you install a water heater anywhere in the country, including rural West Texas, you're required to vent it outdoors because the burning of fossil fuels to heat water produces level of pollution that we all conclude is unsafe. When you get to the gas stove, it is a really interesting history where the gas industry has been very effective at minimizing the conversation as well as the ventilation requirements for gas stoves. So this is a cover of a study released last year from 4 organizations that basically was summarizing 10 years of study from researchers from Australia to the UK to here in the United States. What do we know about what comes when you burn gas indoors in increasingly tight and energy efficient buildings? The basics, we spend, and this was pre-COVID, 90% of our time indoors. We probably spend even more now. EPA for years has said indoor air quality is oftentimes far worse than the outdoors. And then this third category is that the health impacts or the air pollution impacts are much higher, particularly for the pollutant nitrogen dioxide, which is one of 6 pollutants EPA has been working to minimize for over 50 years since we first got a Clean Air Act. 50 to 400 times higher in homes with gas stoves compared to electric stoves, which makes sense. We're burning a fossil fuel indoors in a confined space, and lo and behold, there are levels of air pollution that we may not have previously been thinking about. So as a part of this report, the folks at RMI and elsewhere looked at, okay, so is this just if you use your stove for heating your home, which may happen in an emergency? No. The simple act of baking a cake, boiling water, or just turning on your oven even before you put food in it, preheating it, will result in air pollution levels that exceed what EPA has set for the outdoors, which is 100 parts per billion. That is a pollution limit that EPA updates every 5 years based on the latest science. It gets litigated every time by the industry and the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. It's one of the most robust health measures we have in the country. And here, the simple act of cooking basic food or boiling water is resulting in indoor air pollution that we don't find outdoors. Outdoors, NO2 is a huge success story. There's no county in the country that violates the NO2 standard. The only place we are finding regularly high levels of NO2 is in our kitchens. Why do we care about NO2? Well, it's tied directly to asthma. NO2 is a powerful lung irritant. And in homes with a gas stove, this is a summary of various meta studies. The top line is that you see an increased risk of asthma symptoms at a time when many of you may be familiar with, we have an asthma epidemic across the country that is having enormous impacts, and it's an issue that disproportionately impacts primarily Black children and children from low-income families. So there's a huge equity component in this as well. So 2 studies today, special treat. This actually is hot off the press. I mentioned one. Here's the other one, came out of Australia today. Gas cookers, as they call them in Australia, they described as similar to passive smoking. Passive smoking. So there's a really good health reason, in addition to the climate reasons, to be thinking about addressing gas. So those are a couple of health issues that are in the midst of thinking about electrifying and decarbonizing our buildings. Let me touch on a couple of cost ones. It takes more to add gas to buildings because, of course, every building already has electricity. To add in the gas mains cost between $6,000 and $15,000. The piping upwards of almost $2,400. And then all the chimney and ventilation requirements for the non-stove components, because of course electric appliances don't require venting, but if you have a water heater, it needs to have a chimney, and that's additional costs that range from $270 to $850. And I raise this both because it results in pricing people out of new homes, but also because this is one of the ways that we are seeing the default being gas homes, because many of these costs are hidden. Many of these costs are subsidized by the gas utility. I was before COVID, a few months before COVID, I was in Minnesota talking to a bunch of developers and asked them, why do you build gas? And everyone said, because the gas utility pays me to. So that's all being subsidized in our gas rates. So buried in your gas rates are incentives to put gas service into homes, to new homes, and it's covering, as this chart indicates, a fairly significant amount of costs. So one of the first opportunities to help remove these disincentives from doing the right thing in new construction. So to summarize, gas is the fastest growing climate pollutant, leading cause of premature death from air pollution in the United States. And putting it into new buildings also raises the cost of constructing them, even though many of us don't see those costs because they're hidden in our overall gas bills. So let me turn to, so what's the solution? Again, 10 years ago, the options looked pretty thin or unappealing. And today we have many more efficient, clean alternatives. Obviously, the grid is getting much cleaner with rooftop solar and utility scale solar and wind projects. Clean electricity, renewable electricity can now power efficient, what are largely broken into two buckets: heat pumps for heating water and space, and then induction cooking for cooking experience that is cleaner, faster, and more precise than gas. For those of you not familiar with a heat pump, you have one in your refrigerator today. It operates to take the warm air out of the inside of your fridge, blows warm air on your feet. That's what a heat pump is. And it offers two benefits because it does double duty. It acts as an air conditioner in the summertime, and it acts as a heater in the wintertime. And it's a very simple concept where instead of creating heat, it is simply transferring heat from either the air, and they operate down to as low as 0 degrees Fahrenheit, or some, as my in-laws in Nilles, they have a ground source heat pump, and the ground there is about 55 degrees year-round, providing heating and cooling. So they're very efficient, 3 to 4 times more efficient than conventional systems. And as I mentioned, they work in the summer, they provide cooling, and in the winter, they provide heating. So you only need one device instead of an air conditioner and a furnace. In terms of efficiency, this is where they really offer enormous benefits. Your natural gas boiler is about 80% efficient. So you put one therm of energy in. For the engineers among you, you lose about 20% of the energy. With baseboard resistance electric heaters, it's basically 1-to-1. The breakthrough in heat pumps is now 3 to 4 times more efficient. So 1 unit of energy in it, and you get 3 to 4 units of energy out. So from an efficiency perspective, heat pumps are an amazing development. Let me touch quickly on induction cooktops. Many of us have used coil electric ovens or cooktops. They can sometimes result in burning if you're not a master of using your coil electric. The good news is that there is now a faster, more precise type of electric range known as induction. It uses magnets. In our household, we were skeptical. We got a little hot plate to test it out, and were sold almost instantaneously. It is faster, more precise than gas, and significantly better than the old-fashioned resistance electric. Consumer Reports, similarly, in last year, when they looked at what were their top ranges, the top 2 were induction. So we have alternatives to replace gas that by most all measures are more efficient and better products. And we get a lot of questions about commercial kitchens. There's great examples around the country where chefs and other folks in kitchens love them because it dramatically reduces the temperature and burn risk of working in commercial kitchen spaces. So electric buildings, certainly for new construction, cheaper, healthier, more climate safe, as well as safer as a rule, without having an explosive gas in our living space. So what is happening on this issue? It was a non-issue two years ago. I had the great pleasure of working with the city next door, Berkeley, who passed the climate emergency declaration, and we're trying to work out what can we do locally. It's hard for cities to regulate transport. It is hard for cities to regulate power plants because that's usually done at the state level. Cities typically have plenary authority to work on buildings, and I recognize this varies state by state, but the cities have in many places the ability and are in the business of issuing building permits and putting in various local restrictions to reflect local priorities. Berkeley realized that it was handing out permits to build new gas buildings and was never thinking about the climate impacts, and so went through a 6-month process with workshops and committees. I concluded that it needed to be saying no to new gas buildings. Every building, of course, represents 30, 40, 100 years of new investment in fossil fuel infrastructure and inconsistent with their climate goals. So they took the step, which at the time seemed small, but profound. And it turned out it was the first city in the country to tackle this sector. So that started a raging debate at the city level about, is this something more cities can do? And as of 2 nights ago, when the city of Petaluma joined the list, we now have 60 cities in the country, including San Jose, the 10th biggest city in the country, who have, as a part of their climate commitments, said we're not going to allow new buildings to be using fossil fuels. Across the country, we're seeing other places begin to tackle this. In New York, the mayor is working on a plan to phase out fossil fuels, starting with new buildings. New Jersey has realized that it needs to do something about natural gas to cut emissions. Maine has a really interesting program. They are trying to install 100,000 heat pumps, which is about 1 in 5 homes. In Maine, they use a lot of fuel oil. And fuel oil prices, like propane prices, often spike in the wintertime. And so there's a double benefit here, or triple benefit. They get the climate benefits, the air pollution benefits, and also significant price reductions for Mainers. So this is an exciting program in a cold weather climate where they're also installing heat pumps. Brookline in Massachusetts jump-started a conversation in that state, and the governor just signed into law, a Republican governor signed into law, a bill that requires the state to set a code for new buildings. Seattle joined the fray recently, and then statewide in California, in New York, at the state level, they're putting a significant amount of money into both efficiency, but also importantly, for the first time, into electrification incentives, which will be helping people install heat pumps. Around the globe, in Europe, there's been a big move on it beginning to address buildings, starting in the UK, including a bunch. I won't read all of these, but just to give you a flavor, this is just a summary of the various countries in Europe that are beginning to realize, in addition to electricity and transport, they need to be moving on buildings. And so significant momentum growing across Europe. A couple more slides. Roy, in preparing for this, I had a chance to talk to Roy and Nicole. He reminded me that a lot of people in various parts of the state, across rural parts of the country, use propane. When I was at Rocky Mountain Institute, we did a bunch of analysis, and this is just a slide showing that Wisconsin indeed is in the top 5 among states using propane. As a part of an analysis we did at RMI, the 3 places where it made enormous sense from an economic perspective, starting with economics, to install electric heat pumps were: 1, new construction, for the reasons I mentioned; 2, if they're using fuel oil because of the spikes, particularly in the Northeast where they use a lot of fuel oil; and the 3rd is propane. And so I wanted to flag, as just thinking about the portion of the state that uses propane, that is typically, in most instances, a very cost-effective place to help both reduce the upfront capital costs of replacement, but also on the operating costs, where heat pumps are so much more efficient than propane or fuel oil. A couple of thoughts, summaries of what local jurisdictions are looking at in other places. I mentioned on the new construction side, starting with Berkeley. For existing buildings, there's work going on with local electric utilities, like in Sacramento, Seattle, to help them design programs to make the transition from gas to electric. There's always, there typically is, importantly, a component for how do we make sure low-income families enjoy the benefits of this transition as well. And then in New York, where we have the largest public housing projects, there's actually active work underway to replace gas stoves, particularly in the NYCHA housing, the large low-income housing facilities in that city, because of the concern about the impact of gas stoves on public health. So a lot of stuff going on, an enormous opportunity to address this issue locally. So with that, why don't I close, and I would welcome any comments, questions any of you may have.
Thanks very much. Bruce. Just to lead it off a little bit, I think what I heard when we're dealing with electricity, we normally say the most important and cost-effective thing you can do is use less, is conservation and efficiency. And we look at building codes and insulation, home audits. And what I hear you're saying is an unintended consequence of that, if you're using gas for cooking and water heating and other, is increasing indoor pollution significantly. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's two of the, I think I would add, in addition to the air pollution, particularly as we tighten up the shell, double pane windows, more insulation, if that's not at the same time being very mindful about ventilation, you end up with higher indoor air pollution, particularly around the gas stove. The other appliances are supposed to be vented outdoors, but there are a lot of stories of if the water heater, for example, is inside your building shell, there are ways that that pollution ends up leaking inside your building space. But the big concern is tight buildings and gas stoves. I think the other thing I would add is it's always a good idea to do efficiency. Anything we can do to use less particularly helps with people struggling to pay the utility bills. But it's also clear that efficiency alone will not solve the climate change problem. In addition to making our housing and commercial buildings more energy efficient, we need to be thinking about how do we get the carbon out, and that means replacing the fossil fuel appliances with electric. And again, what's exciting is we now have this opportunity that we did not have 10 years ago because we have hyper efficient electric appliances that use considerably less energy than the old electric appliances from 10 years ago.
Great. I see we have in the order they're here, Kathy Kuntz from who runs the Dane County Climate and Energy Program and used to run Focus on Energy, has a question. Kathy, why don't you unmute and ask your question directly?
Sure. Okay, that worked. Hey, Bruce, this was a terrific talk. The thing I was thinking about in the early piece there, you know, it's really clear that this gas is a danger in our homes in Wisconsin. Coming from Focus on Energy, it's particularly troubling where we have high efficiency furnaces that power vent out the side of the house and an older water heater that's still going up the chimney. A lot of those water heaters can backdraft, folks. That's a real risk. My question though is how we make this happen. You know, we're in this hopefully post-COVID moment where we couldn't get people to believe the science of wearing masks. And now we want to take their beloved gas stoves away from them. And I've been thinking a lot about this question in like, where is going to be the pitch that is going to bring everyone along at the speed we need to bring them along?
It's a great question, Kathy. I've been talking to a lot of people about this electrification issue and my own realization that again, these 4 appliances, I had no idea it was a big piece of my carbon footprint. And there was this thinking about this gas stove in my kitchen where we sit and have dinner every night. And it never occurred to me, of course, it's a fossil fuel in an enclosed space. This can't be good. And I actually, when I read all these studies, I didn't believe it. And I was like, how can I have missed this? So I found a guy who makes high-end NO2 monitors over in Berkeley. And he's a global provider of these expensive pieces of equipment, including he works with City of Paris. They're in every schoolyard to measure particulates and emissions to make sure diesel from the highway isn't impacting kids in the schoolyard. Super cool pieces of equipment. And I asked him, have you ever put one in your kitchen? He's like, why would I put one in my kitchen? And I said, there's 40 years of studies indicating dangerous levels of air pollution. He went home that night, cooked for 40 minutes, 2 burners in his oven, and blew the limit 2.5 times. He was floored, and he's been doing this for decades. And so I do think there's a lot of education to be done. The good news is that the electric products are better. So we're not asking people to eat their peas, so to speak. We're saying, hey, it's like the electric car. If you've had the pleasure of driving an electric car, at least from my perspective, is just a better product. I never have to go to the gas station. I charge it at home, and it's faster and cleaner than the gasoline alternative. And it has a lot less maintenance, right? No oil changes, et cetera. So I think with different audiences, there'll be different messages. And this will get a lot easier if we can get our local utilities not to subsidize the gas piece. Because again, going back to my experience in Minnesota, home builders are doing what makes sense from a bottom line. And today they're being paid a lot of money by the local gas utility put in gas to make sure the gas utility has customers for the next 30, 40 years. And so anything we can do to level the playing field with a better product, educating people about the health and climate benefits, probably goes a long way of helping underscore or helping make the kind of progress we need at the pace we need to make it.
Thanks. And now I see we have a question from Sharon Gaskill. Sharon, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
No, we don't. I don't want to.
Okay, well, I'll ask it if I can.
Yeah, you ask it.
Sharon's question is, are air exchange heaters still improving to heat my home? Should I buy one now in Wisconsin, or should I wait? I think is what the question is.
This is where I'm going to have to say I don't know the right answer to this one. This one is beyond my technical know-how. My understanding is yes, but I'd want to double check depending on your local climate. So I would ask your local HVAC experts. I know that they have enormous promise in a lot of places. Whether or not it makes sense in your home in Door County, I would double check with your HVAC provider.
On heat exchangers, Bruce, I know up here at the Ridges, your in-laws home was at the Ridges put in a new building a few years ago. And I was involved on the board, and we did a geothermal system, deep wells, vertical wells. I think it's worked very well. It's a challenge to get going, but the beauty of it is that it provides dehumidification in the summer, air conditioning, which is big when you're on the side of the lake, as well as heating in the winter. Electric bill goes up or usage goes up by maybe 15%, perhaps because of the fans and heat exchangers. But I know it did work well in that context.
Yeah, my in-laws love in New Glarus. They love their geothermal system. I mean, it's quiet, it hums along, and meets all their heating and cooling needs.
Let's see, I have a question from Cindy Carter, whose question has to do with gas used for electric generation. And she correctly indicates a lot of gas is being used for electric generation. It has replaced coal in the dispatch because the cost of natural gas came down so dramatically. So it had the benefit of driving some coal out of the market and pushing retirement of coal. But at the same time, we used to say it provided about 50% of the carbon dioxide that a coal generator would. So there was a gain. But at this point, with growing gas, I assume that is a major issue for climate today.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, Roy, the other thing is the science is telling us we're not heading to 50% reduction or 80% reduction. We got to get to zero if we're going to try to restore a safe and long-term healthy climate. And gas just doesn't fit in a zero fossil fuel future. So the work ahead is how do we manage this transition? We're obviously not going to turn all the coal off tomorrow, but hopefully in the next 5-10 years. And then right behind that, how do we phase out the gas at a similar clip? And that all depends on how quickly we build wind and solar. I do think there's some really exciting news in the state about solar. I remember back, Roy, when we were working on the task force, solar was seen as a California or a Florida or a Southern thing, and people were highly skeptical, understandably, at the time because of the price, about whether solar would ever work in the northern climates. Today, there is a huge pipeline of solar projects for the state, and the costs have come down fivefold in a decade, and it's now cost effective in every corner of the 48 states. And so we now have opportunities between wind, solar, and storage to be thinking not about just getting rid of coal, but also how do we also get rid of gas in the power sector. I just saw yesterday in the Central Plains region from North Dakota down to Oklahoma, they've been building a lot of wind power. There was a day in April when they hit 87% clean energy. 87% of the power provided from North Dakota down to Oklahoma. At a couple times during the day hit 87%. So obviously that's just a moment in time, but that's the future we can quickly get to as we build out clean and replace coal and gas.
Now, I think the big challenge from my perspective, serving on the board of entity that oversees the reliability of the electric system, is storage, because the sun doesn't shine all the time, and particularly at night, and the wind doesn't blow, but the electric system has to be reliable 24 hours a day, all the time. We were becoming increasingly reliant on it, and customer toleration of interruptions is very low. Talk to them in Texas. So there has to be something that fills the time when the wind and the solar are not there or are not sufficiently there. And right now that's gas in a lot of places. So it's storage is the big question mark out there in terms of making that transition.
I think that's right, but storage is obviously mostly being seen as likely to be in the form of batteries. And the news on batteries is the same news with electric vehicles, which is the price and the efficiency have been making remarkable gains. And so in California and Texas, New York, there's been major investments in storage, and we're beginning to drive down the price of storage just like we did with solar. So what seemed implausible a few years ago is now able to replace with solar and storage together entire gas plants, which we couldn't even be thinking about 5 years ago. But you're absolutely right. I think the other thing I would add, Roy, is living in a state where, because of wildfires front and center last fall for many, many weeks, the power went out. And so we had this big question about resilience, and people get pretty excited, understandably, when we have no electricity. The gas system also fails when we have no electricity. Every gas appliance has electricity. And so the blower in your furnace doesn't work if you don't have electricity. And so as we're thinking about how are we going to build our overall economy to be resilient, mission critical is that we have reliable electricity. And in part, I think that's what we saw in Texas, because both the gas grid and the electric grid went down, and spending money to make both resilient is an enormous amount of money. If we can build just one resilience, and that meets all of our needs with clean electricity, there's actually some enormous cost savings that we might realize.
We've got a few other questions on here. I'm going to try to jump through them for time's sake. One is from John Bauer, who says he has a 2-year-old electric heat pump that he understood is the best made by Lennox. But below 24 degrees Fahrenheit, it goes off and switches to resistance, electric resistance heating. But you mentioned heat pumps are appliances that can get down to zero. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Sure. The best summary I've seen is the state of Maine, which I mentioned has this very extensive program to deploy 100,000 heat pumps to 1 in 5 homes in Maine. As part of getting ready for that and helping build the consumer confidence, they worked with the Northeast Efficiency Project and a couple other organizations to test independently all the heat pumps and come up with a list of what they call cold weather heat pumps. So John, you're right. There are heat pumps that are made for different climates. You flagged one where at 24 degrees, it switches over to resistance. There are others that operate down to 5 or below. And the state of Maine has a great website, as does the NEEP folks, the National Energy Efficiency Project folks, laying out which brands do which.
Thanks. Another question from someone which I'm sure is shared by some folks up here. What data do you have, or what do you think about heating with wood?
This is personally a hard one. I love wood fire. We also know that wood stoves emit a lot of particulate matter if they're not well maintained. So there is data out there, and part of the Harvard study today was a good reminder that in urban areas like here in Oakland, you're not allowed to build new homes with wood smoke, with wood stoves, but there are existing homes with wood stoves. And there are days in the year there's a wood stove moratorium because the air pollution is so bad. So I love them. I'd be heartbroken if we didn't have them. The data says they're not a good idea in densely populated areas because they do generate a fair amount of smoke. In the UK, where I spent some years as a child, they just put in new requirements for wood stoves. They're banning the burning of wet wood, green wood. I'm not sure how they're going to enforce all this, but they are trying to really crack down on the significant particle pollution that comes from wood stoves. So, and there are studies out there looking at what stoves do for indoor air quality on the particulate side, which is a different pollution than what comes from your wood stove. But poorly designed and poorly ventilated, they do create indoor air quality problems as well.
Another question from Jeff Lutzy, who I think this is also an issue shared by many of us, that we have various appliances in our houses and we don't have the money to fix everything. So how do we decide what appliances, what's out there to help us evaluate what appliances we should replace first?
Yeah.
Gas appliances first is what we're hearing. What about old electrical appliances that are inefficient?
So existing homes range enormously depending on how big your electric capacity is. The place where Rocky Mountain Institute identified some cost savings for existing homes was where you were replacing your AC unit. So if you're getting at any point close to replacing your AC unit and your furnace at the same time, buying one device, a heat pump, instead of having two devices, there's savings to be had immediately. So that, if you can find a time when they're basically both at the end of their life, that is where we're seeing the biggest savings. Furnaces typically last 15 to 20 years, water heaters about 10 years. So the other recommendation is when your water heater goes out, you typically want it replaced in a matter of hours. It's an emergency job. Making sure it is ready to be replaced with an electric alternative so that if and when you are ready to replace your water heater, it can be replaced with electric, is the other big recommendation in terms of sequencing from gas to electric. And on the gas stove, the gas stove will last forever. My recommendation is using the vent if you have one, recognizing they're often noisy, as well as cracking a window always helps in terms of ventilation. But the more and more, I'm happy to send along any references or sources. The science on stoves, and if there's anyone with asthma or other respiratory ailments in your home, the sooner you can address the gas stove, probably the better.
So as between ground source, there's a question between ground source heat pumps and the heat exchangers we were talking about for Wisconsin. Is there is one better than the other because of our cold climate?
So a few years ago, the majority of heat pumps were ground source. Today, it is so much cheaper upfront capital costs to go with an air source heat pump. And given the climate in Wisconsin, particularly the more mild climate in Door County, it's hard to see ground source competing with what we can do today with air source heat pumps. Interestingly, I mean, there's some countries where basically they're already all electric, places like Korea and Japan, which have been some of the early innovators on heat pumps. In some parts of the country in the United States, there's a fascinating geographic split. The sort of northern tier of countries and the West Coast and the Northeast basically went from electric to gas heating in the 50s and 60s. Some of you may remember Ronald Reagan's gold medallion GE ads. There used to be this, one of the most successful ad campaigns in the country was electric utilities promoting the sale of electric appliances, and Ronnie and Nancy had their all electric home, and you got a gold medallion if you had an all electric home. What happened was everybody put on these new appliances. They were very inefficient. We then started building nuclear power plants that were going to be so cheap, too cheap to meter. Turned out they weren't as cheap as we'd all hope. Electric rates went through the roof. And what most of the country did, other than the South and Southeast, is we went to gas because we were in the middle of high price electricity challenges. The flip side of that is today in the Southeast, there's a lot of heat pumps being installed. It's a place where we install most of the heat pumps because they never went to gas. So in Orlando, Florida, there's no gas service. When you get a home, it's already all electric. So there is this other fascinating geographic split. A long way of saying electric heat pumps, air source heat pumps, are now widely available around the world and are in most instances more cost effective than geothermal.
To wrap up, there is one other question here, which is a little bit off point, but I'll see what you have to say. It goes to legislative insight in Wisconsin about the ability for commercial providers to provide solar and wind power to homes and to businesses, which is actually in litigation in the state now, at the PSC at least.
I might not answer that question specifically because I realize there's a related piece I did not touch on. So there is a vigorous debate right now in Congress about the American Jobs Plan, a huge $3 to $4 trillion effort by Joe Biden to restart the economy. A big piece of that will be investments in clean, efficient energy, including, as his plan says, a huge focus on energy efficiency and building electrification. So without knowing whether or not Congress will in fact put it all in place, we'll know hopefully by the fall, it would be very surprising if there wasn't some major incentives for heat pumps. So if you all are thinking about any of this and any of it makes any sense, there may be a timeline here in the not too distant future where Congress reinstates, because we did have one until 3 years ago, tax rebate or other grant programs to help homeowners and landlords transition from gas to electric appliances, assuming the major pillars of the American Jobs Plan do in fact come into law later this year.
Sounds good. There's solar above my head on our roof, and I can tell you that the federal tax credit, which was 30% at the time, was very helpful, really helpful. And on that last question, the issue for people who are not in the industry is that Wisconsin is a regulated monopoly state. And so the argument is when a business puts solar on your roof, are they selling you electricity? If they're selling you electricity, then are they an electric utility subject to regulation by the Public Service Commission, and they're in somebody else's exclusive territory? There's a lot of legal arguments around that issue, and I'm sure it's going to grow as time goes on. But a legislative fix in the short term, I'd be very skeptical of that happening. So, well, thank you very much, Bruce. Really appreciate it. Great presentation. And I'd like to thank everybody else for joining us tonight, and tune in next month on the first Wednesday in June for Steve Favris on Wisconsin climate impacts. Thanks and good evening.
Thank you. Good night.